This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College, and this week I'll be moving on to talk about ancient China. China is, of course, a major civilization, part of the River Valley civilization that starts in the famous Yellow River, also called the Wang Ho. And of course, if you know about China, China is well known for its many royal dynasties. Of course, many with their famous emperors a long time ago. So, with this lecture, I'll kind of go into a lot of the background of ancient China. I'll talk about its geography first, and then I'll get into how it eventually developed into a lot of major early type of dynasties ruled mostly by kings, such as the Shang Dynasty and the Zhou Dynasty. Then I'll talk about the rise of the empire. Of course, you have the imperial empire under the so-called Qin Dynasty, also called Qin, which is very well known for developing the Great Wall of China, which was, if you know about this, built to block barbarians from the north coming out of Mongolia. So I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the rise of also the Han and Tang dynasties, which were some major dynasties of really what we call the golden age of China, which was really the peak of China in ancient times. I'll also talk about a lot about philosophy as well. Chinese philosophy also begins in ancient times, especially you have famous philosophers like Confucius that influenced the rise of Confucianism. So those are some of the things I'll kind of be talking about with this lecture on ancient China. China, by the way, will be later assessed on the second exam, along with, of course, ancient Greece as well. Kind of first talk about the background of ancient China. I'm going to kind of get into and discuss like the early stages of it. China itself is a pretty old civilization. It's not quite as old, compared to say Mesopotamia, but using the dating of ancient China, somewhere between 6 to maybe as far back as 8,000 BC. So 7,000 might be a good average of how old it is. Yellow River, also called the Wang Ho in China, is of course about where ancient China started. The Yellow River is considered to be like the mother river of China. And they think that that's where a lot of early production of like rice started, which, rice is a major crop of China. I think I want to say 1/4 of the crops that they produce is mostly rice. And, a lot of Chinese dishes, like, restaurants or whatever, rice is a major staple. That's part of that. So yeah, I'm going to kind of get into the background of ancient China. Here's kind of an image of China right here on the right. They do think that China started, before Neolithic times. I was talking like 6 to 8,000 BC, maybe being where, so-called Neolithic times when farming started. But Paleolithic China, it goes back probably over 1 million years ago. Where you had people living close to the Yellow River Valley. And we talked about Peking Man before, I think, which was that famous Homo erectus fossils that were found along the Yellow River close to about the 1920s in modern China. And so, yeah, they think early humans were living that far back, of course, in parts of Asia. But the first written records don't really start about 13th century BC. So that's kind of, the early stages of China a long time ago. But farming, like I told you, starts about, close to about 8 to 10,000 years ago. That's roughly when it began. So yeah, I want to talk about some kind of get into like geography, a little bit about China. Like, of course, you can see most of China is located in what we call the People's Republic of China today. Of course, everybody, of course, knows that now, which People's Republic of China was a communist state that started in 1949, which, look at that image on the bottom right there. Mao Zedong, you may have heard of him, of course, famous founder of the People's Republic of China, way more like a socialist state that's now got capitalism. And there it is, of course, People's Republic of China, which is famous red flag you see right there. Yeah, China's kind of situated. You can see in that map between like to the west, you've got like India, Kazakhstan, and Pakistan. The south, you've got like Southeast Asia. To the east, you've got like the Korean states, North, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. And to the north, you can see Mongolia and Russia. So you kind of see it situated kind of in East Asia, would basically be about where it is. And kind of show you a map of China itself right here. Uh, most of they think like ancient China a long time ago developed kind of like around the Yellow River or Wang Ho, as they called it, the eastern part of Asia, close where the East China Sea is, and the Yangtze River. So that area right there, it's about the region of where ancient China got started. And there's an area that's kind of like in that circle right there. They call it the North China Plain. It's kind of like situated like around where Beijing is, going all the way down to where the Yangtze River is. And that was actually like a type of alluvial plain where China mostly developed, which was due to silt deposits from primarily the Yellow River over time, which built up a plain there, which is very fertile, of course. And of course, they grew a lot of crops there. And so in that region is where you get a lot of the early states of China, like the Shang Dynasty, I'll get to later, in the Zhou Dynasty, etc., all kind of start in that area of that region. But if you go back to that map I was showing you right here, there's other features of China that are kind of important too, that help to isolate it and create, what would be a unique Chinese culture, which, to the west, you can see they've got a lot of deserts and mountains that kind of block people from coming in. Gobi Desert, of course, most famous desert up there at the Sahara, in the world. Gobi Desert is kind of situated, you can see, between Mongolia and northern China. It's about 500,000 square miles in size, the Gobi Desert. It's not really till the Huns and others kind of get horses and things like that. They're able to kind of come down and attack China. Mongols later too. And Mongols and the Huns are kind of related. And that forced the Chinese to build the Great Wall of China to block them with a huge, fortification. But you got other mountains like the Altai Mountains are in the kind of northwest, close to Mongolia. Kilian Mountains. You got the Kunlun Mountains, you can see. They also got the Himalayas and the Tibetan mountains, or Tibetan Plateau. It's called different names. But they got like mountains all over the place that kind of block people from really getting in. So also that other desert too, Taklamakan Desert, is another desert that's kind of to the western part of China too. That's kind of situated between two mountain ranges. So it's kind of showing you a map, but you can see like the rivers of China, the Yangtze and the Yellow flow west to east across China. And they kind of empty into, like, the Yellow River empties into the Yellow Sea, and then the Yangtze empties into the East China Sea. And by the way, those two rivers, the Yangtze is the longest river in Asia, also in China. It's about 3,900 miles long. And then the Yellow River, it's also called Wang Ho, is the second longest river in Asia and China. It's about 3,400 miles, to kind of give you an idea. And I think I've got another map I thought I had that kind of shows more of the geographic features. We can see like the Tibetan Plateau to the west and the Himalayas kind of blocks people from really coming in to China. So kind of hard to get in. Of course, a lot of deserts too to the west. You can see China's more fertile in its eastern southern part, where of course they grow a lot of crops in that region. And to the east, you've got Yellow Sea, Pacific Ocean, all that as well. Now, yeah, crops in China, that's of course something else. The Chinese, of course, have all kinds of crops that they grow agricultural wise. If you know about, I think the Chinese today, like the People's Republic of China produce something like 20% of the world's food. Give you an idea of how much crops that they produce overall. And their chief crops, by the way, are these. Mostly, most of their crops they grow are grain crops, which I think most countries in the world do that mostly overall. But the two most famous that went back to ancient times is millet and rice. Millet's more of a grain crop that's grown in arid or drier conditions. Obviously, rice, you got to grow in more wetter conditions. Like a lot that in Southeast Asia, they grow a lot of rice. But also, modern China has a lot of other grains like wheat and corn, sorghum, barley. I think rice and corn. Yeah, rice and corn are their two main crops they grow the most in China. Tea, of course, China produces the most tea in the world. I think that's India after that. Second, potatoes, of course, cotton, sugarcane, which sugarcane they think originated that part of Asia as well. We grow a lot of sugarcane in Louisiana. I think Louisiana produces the most sugarcane out of all the 50 states overall, but it's nothing compared to what China produces with sugarcane. But yeah, I think rice and maize, or we call it corn, are their main crops. And then I think after that, it's wheat. I think it's pretty much the crops that they grow overall. So you can see kind of an image right here. So China is the world's largest producer of rice. So they produce the most rice overall. Wheat, corn, millet follows rice in importance overall. So kind of give you an idea of different crops that they grow. But yeah, rice, wheat, and corn, that's their principal crops that they grow the most. Yeah, let me talk about the Yellow River also as well. Kind of discuss, the river itself. Like that's, like I said, where China started, like around the Yellow River Basin, which is called the Wangho. It starts in the Tibetan highlands and then flows eastward across China, emptying into the Yellow Sea. And of course, it's known for being very muddy, like a muddy river, kind of like the Mississippi River is going by Baton Rouge in Louisiana. And it's known for having this yellow-brown soil or silt that's in it. That's called less. So I think I've got images of less, which is right here. And less is like a type of, it's like a type of silt or sediment that's flows down from like the deserts and mountains in the west. You'll see it sometimes along the bluff of rivers, like you're seeing right here with that. And suppose it has a lot of calcium carbonate in it, which kind of gives it that color. And so hence you'll see that, and sometimes you'll see like that too, also as well. Kind of a brownish, sandy looking color. But suppose it washes down into the river, it helps to create that alluvial plain. That's part of that so-called North China Plain I was of course talking about. Also, they call it another nickname you may have heard about, which is China's Sorrow. And they call it the Yellow River that because the fact that the Yellow River was known for a lot of flooding, which has killed a lot of people a long time ago. I think they've had two major floods in their history that's real famous with the Yellow River. 1887 flood. That flood supposedly killed somewhere between 1 to 2 million people. But the flood they had in 1931, I think it's often called the China flood or 1931, killed the most people, not just in China, but worldwide. It's, I think, considered the 1931 flood in China is considered to be the worst natural disaster in human history. They're not sure how many people died. It's anywhere from 400,000, I think I've seen minimum, up to 4 million. So if you want to average that out, at least 2 million may have died from flooding along the river. So that's why some of the rivers like the Yangtze and others have been kind of like they built dams along the river to control flooding and also to create hydroelectricity as well to, for cities and so on. Yeah, so you have images like here. That's a image, of course, in 1931 in China, where, of course, the Yellow River flooded, as an example. And I think they had a nickname they sometimes called the Yellow River. It was sometimes called the Scourge of the Sons of Han, or something like that, because of all the flooding that happened, and in fact, that killed a lot of people over time. Now, of course, like the Yangtze River, they've built the Three Gorges Dam you may have heard about, which is considered to be the largest hydroelectric dam built in the world. So right there, and so yeah, it's basically built downstream from the Three Gorges Canyon along the Yangtze River. So it's kind of considered one of the most famous dams that was built in the world. Also, I did want to talk about inventions. That's something else, the Chinese are kind of famous for. There's a lot of different inventions that kind of changed the world, not just in China, but, worldwide overall. And if you look at that image right there, some of the greatest inventions that the Chinese, of course, came up with, gunpowder, which, gunpowder was later used, for fireworks, weapons like guns, cannon, and so that would really revolutionize warfare, over time. The development of the compass, which I think that developed later, more in the Middle Ages, but the compass was an invention that totally changed the world, like with navigation of ships and so on. They think that Marco Polo may have introduced that to the West. Paper and printing. They were the first to make paper out of like tree wood, as an example. And then they also had the first printing presses that they developed in China as well. I forgot another big weapon they invented too, besides with gunpowder and all that later. The crossbow is a famous invention you may have heard of. Also silk. Silk is something famous, type of cloth made from the silkworm. Is another thing, of course, they're well known for. But yeah, you can see other inventions on the left, besides paint, paper, and ink, and things like that, printing and silk. The wheelbarrow, like variations of the wheelbarrow, may have been invented by them. Various aspects of like the decimal system were kind of developed by the Chinese. Abacus, it's on the left side, you can see. The water wheel, or variations of the water wheel, which water wheels are, you see that in the West too, going back to Egyptian, Greco-Roman times. They had variations of the sundial. They had astronomy, developed variations of paint, like paint and glass and things like that. Pottery wheel, porcelain. Porcelain, of course, we call China, that's something they're very famous for. Paper, money. Of course, we talked about the compass. Dominoes. They do think they invented dominoes. Jump rope, kites, playing cards, something that they think the Chinese invented. The folding umbrella, that's definitely something the Chinese invented. Crossbow just talked about. Ice cream, something else that they think they invented. Other things, I think the donut and I think the noodle, those kind of things, like food things. There's a lot of different food things that, of course, they invented. One thing they didn't invent, by the way, in China was the fortune cookie. It was developed by Chinese Americans, I think in New York or something like that, like in restaurants, and like in America. That was later, but that's kind of, you think of fortune cookies or whatever. But anyway, yeah, those are all kinds of different kinds of inventions that they're kind of known for, innovations that kind of, changed the world. But yeah, gunpowder, compass, paper, and printing, I think those might be the most influential, probably overall. All right, yeah, I want to get in next. I want to talk about the Shang Dynasty that comes in. This is considered like one of the first major dynasties that rules over China, which they think it kind of dates back to close to about the 16th century overall. 16th century to the 11th century is about when they lived. And it is considered the second longest dynasty in China's history. The longest I'll get to later is called the Zhou dynasty, which reigns afterwards. And the Shang and the Zhou were dynasties that were ruled by kings. They didn't have emperors yet until that emperor they talked about, Qin Shi Huang, comes in and creates a Chinese empire. And it had a nickname. It was sometimes called the Yin Dynasty because they had a capital that was called Yin or also called Yinzhou, either one. And the ruins of it are located in Anyang in China, a major city in China. And so they call it that name too, either Shang Dynasty or Yin Dynasty, either one. Here's an image right here about where it was. So you can see on the right there in that map, that's about where the Shang Dynasty was, which it was based around the Yellow River Basin. You can see that Chinese dynasties go back, they think 3,600 years. So, you go back to like the 16th century up to like the 20th century. I think the last dynasty, ended in the early 1900s with the Qing dynasty, of course, being eventually abdicated. Last emperor abdicated, and so yeah, Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, Tang, Ming, Qing. I think those right there, not all of them, but those are the chief ones that are considered to be the most famous ones in ancient China. But like the ones like from the emperor, like from the Qin dynasty or Qin dynasty, that one, of course, is where you have emperors up to like I think 1912, when the last emperor of China stepped down. But all that before that, Shang and the Zhou, they're all, of course, had kings. There is this political theory they sometimes talk about, which is the mandate of heaven. You may have heard of. I'll kind of talk about that more later when I get to the Zhou dynasty because they invented it. But the mandate of heaven was a political theory where it was believed that the kings and emperors of China ruled because of God in heaven. It's kind of similar to kind of like divine right of kings, maybe in later modern Europe. But it's believed that the gods would decide what kings, what emperors in their dynasties would rule. And if the ruler was unjust, he could be replaced by a ruler that was more just. So that whole thing was like, is he keeping up the mandate of heaven, ruling properly and things like that? And so that's part of why there's a rise and fall of dynasties throughout China because of, some emperors coming in and they're not very good and they get replaced by dynasties that are better. Let me get in, of course, there. There's the actual capital, of course, I was talking about of what is the so-called Shang or the Yin dynasty. They think that was considered the first capital of China a long time ago, which it mostly was between the 4th and the 12th centuries BC. They may have had about 12 kings that ruled there at one point. It's kind of like an archaeological site that's in China today. And they do have records that they found there of a king that ruled going back to the Shang dynasty, whose name was Wu Ding, lived in the 1200s BC. He's considered the first Chinese ruler that they write about in ancient times, because like I told you, there's no written records before the 13th century. I think there was even a theory that there was some kind of dynasty that ruled before that was called the Xia dynasty that had different kings, but they don't know if it was a real dynasty or not. It may have been something that's legendary or mythological. So they consider that to be the Shang to be really the first, at least true kingdom that kind of takes off in China. And it was called either Yin or Yinzhou was the name that they went by. Here's another kind of image, of course, of some of the actual archaeological site, which they found like tombs that were buried there that actually had like some rulers that they found. I think even some queens that they found that were buried there. Now, one thing I did want to talk about the Shang, which is very famous. They're well known for the so-called oracle bones. I think you may have heard about oracle bones. And oracle bones were these bones or shells that were used to tell prophecy. I think they use the term they use, which is divination or telling the future. And it's actually considered like an early form of Chinese calligraphy that led to the written Chinese language over time. And so they think that the actual language system dates at least to the 13th century BC, and they found thousands of these shells, like these shells and bones that they've used. And anyway, I think supposedly how they would work, they had like these various Shang priests. They were associated with some kind of early Chinese religion that would write calligraphy on it, which would be like questions toward the gods, like will my son have an heir or something like that, or it would like I guess ask prophecy about the crops and growing crops and things like that in China. And so that's primarily what they would. I think they would take them and they would put them over a fire to kind of see if they could see the future or whatever. And they think about 150,000 of these oracle bones have been found in China. I think they found them buried or something like that. Like I was talking about at the city of Yin or Yinzhou. And they think that's where they get some of the early Chinese like characters that are used in Chinese calligraphy, like writing over time. Which I think today there's thousands of them that are now used today in the language, modern language today, like different variations of Chinese. But I think back then it was only like a few hundred at the time. So it's considered like I guess the beginning of what they call old or archaic Chinese, which is what they call early Chinese language that develops in, I guess, back during what would be the Bronze Age at the time. Here's kind of another image showing like an oracle book. So in other words, turtle shells that they would write on, which you can see. So you can see early versions of what would be later Chinese character type writing. They did have religious beliefs, which I think the common god that they believed in was called Shang Ti or Shang Di. It's usually the common name they would call it, which Shang Di was believed to be some kind of supreme god that lived in heaven. But the Chinese were polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. And I think there's different translations of what Shang Di means. I think some people think it means supreme god or supreme deity above or something like that. And then the kings and emperors, if you know about that later, which we'll talk about, they're either called Wang or Wang Di, kind of a variations of that, which means son of heaven, basically. So the gods in heaven and the king or emperor is like the son of, I guess, the supreme god in heaven. And so that's the name they often use for the emperors. So that's kind of like some of their Shang beliefs that they have, believing all these different gods. A lot of these guys are kind of associated with nature a lot of times, and of course the heavens and things like that. Also, Shang pottery is also something you see like bronze, jade, and other things being used to make pottery. And so, yeah, that's something that they're famous for, like early Chinese pottery, early ceramic type, China we knew about, later porcelain. It's all kind of starting to kind of develop in China back then in the Bronze Age. Now, I did want to talk about this other dynasty that comes in later, like close to about the 11th century, which is the Zhou dynasty, how they usually say it. And the Zhou dynasty was a dynasty that started more into the western part of the Yellow River. I think the Wei River, they called it, which is more of a branch of the Yellow River in China. Kind of blow up that image right there. You can see, so you can see that's eventually what will be the Zhou. It's usually pronounced Zhou. Some people say Zhou also as well. But that's basically where it'll eventually develop overall. And the Zhou, like I was saying, is the longest reigning dynasty in Chinese history. They reigned like something like 7-8 centuries that they were in power, between the 11th to the 3rd centuries BC. Although at the end of it, if you know about it, they started to decline during that period. And it was founded by this family called the Ji family, Ji, see there, Ji family. And supposedly that was the family that developed what they call the Mandate of Heaven that I was talking about, which the actual Chinese name is Tian Ming, how you say it in Chinese. And part of why the Zhou dynasty developed the Mandate of Heaven was because they were trying to say like why they had taken over China and conquered the Shang, because the Shang weren't living up to God's mandate in heaven, the supreme God in heaven, and so they felt like they had a right to rule as the legitimate son of heaven. Now rules as the king. Some of it's also kind of because there could be other things that cause that, like there could be like famines and natural disasters that might cause that to occur, where a certain king or a dynasty might take over. But quite often, they think because of that too. That maybe the gods are doing that for retribution, some kind of divine retribution, because they're not a good ruler, and so they deserve to be replaced over time. Some other things too. Another thing too, they have two different periods I'll kind of talk about with the Zhou dynasty. Like they reign kind of from the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age. And one thing about the Zhou dynasty, it is one of the first in China to develop like an Iron Age military, where they have new kinds of technologies that come in at that point. I kind of show some things right here, but they're the first to introduce like iron weapons to China, which that kind of revolutionized warfare a lot. Which iron weapons are proved to be better than bronze weapons. And then, of course, the other thing that the Zhou were known for, I think they were the ones that originally developed the crossbow. So the crossbow is something that goes back to ancient times. That's kind of maybe what it looked like on the right early crossbows. And so the crossbow later came west, towards, I guess, Marco Polo, when he went to Asia, discovered the crossbow and, of course, brought that back to Europe. And that changed like medieval warfare, things like that in the future. Also, some other things too. I'm kind of talking about how they had different periods under the Zhou dynasty. They have two periods. They have a period that's called the Western Zhou. The Western Zhou goes from about 1046 to 771 BC. It's where the state kind of develops along the Wei River Valley, which is kind of a branch of the Yellow River. It's kind of like in almost the central part of China today. But what happened was their capital got sacked by these nomads, and they had a capital called Haojing. They abandoned it and they fled. The actual state pushed more to the eastern part. I guess the eastern part of the Yellow River Valley. And so you have this other period they call the Eastern Zhou, which the dates on that you can see 771 to about 256 BC. That's more of an Iron Age state in China, which the state itself is famous for a capital called Luoyang, you may have heard of, which Luoyang is considered like one of the first major capitals in China, before like Chang'an, Beijing, and others that follow later. Or I think they also have like Nanking, I think was another capital at one point in China. And the Eastern Zhou occurs during these two periods called the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period, which I'll kind of go into those two periods today and discuss a little bit. But like I said, the Mandate of Heaven, that's something that the Zhou dynasty was known for developing. That symbol right there on that top right, next to the Great Wall, that's the symbol of the Ji family that originally created the actual Zhou dynasty. I'll also talk about some other things too about the Zhou dynasty. I need to, of course, talk about one big thing that's real famous about the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou is very famous for the so-called feudal period of China, because China goes through kind of a period for like eight or nine centuries where they have feudalism throughout the country, where there's kind of a hierarchy between the king, the various lords and vassals, and then all the peasants, which of course are on the bottom. It's kind of been often compared with medieval Europe somewhat, and it's called the Feng Jin system, and that's usually the order of who's in it. Usually you've got God in heaven, right? Like the supreme God we were talking about. Then you've got the king, or later emperor, is at the top. And he's got all of his lords that are under him. And then what they would do is, if you go to that image on the right, they also had the common people, which the common people were broken down into four different occupations. You got the Shi, which are like the landed gentry, basically, like kind of own some of the land. The Nong, which are like your peasant farmers. Your Gong, which are artisans and craftsmen. And the Shang, essentially named there, Shang, were people that were like merchants and traders. So that's how they broke down Chinese society back in ancient times, and kind of similar to later, I guess, of what it will be in China. And one difference between, they say, like going back to ancient, medieval China later, is that feudalism was not like in Europe. Like if you're say a merchant or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean your son will be. Because, a lot of things, like, I guess back in like medieval Europe, feudalism, a lot of times if you're like a peasant or whatever, like a serf, your son's a serf, your daughter's a serf, that kind of thing, but not necessarily within the feudal system. And even like the kings, the emperors later, doesn't necessarily have to be a nobleman. It could be, you have cases where a commoner will actually become a king or an emperor. I'll get to later, like the founder of the Han Dynasty was supposedly a commoner. So that's something that's interesting about their feudal system. So people on the bottom could still end up being, like a ruler. Oh, another thing they had too, you may have heard of under the Zhou Dynasty in the feudal period, they had what they call the well field system. That was a system of land between, like, I guess, the lord and I guess the peasant farmers, where they would divide the fields up into 9 parts, where you've got, like, you can see there 8 private sections, and there's a public section. And what would happen is the peasants would basically grow crops for, like, their lord. Like that public area, that would be specifically for the lord to give him crops. And in the other land, which I guess still owned by the lord, they would get to grow the crops for themselves. So it's kind of similar. You see that, I think, also you do see that in medieval Europe too, that kind of system too, also being employed as well. And that's something that's kind of unique, I guess, during that time period. But the only bad thing about this feudal period is that it weakened the Zhou dynasty over time, because you get these lords or overlords that kind of start taking over the country, and China eventually breaks up is one thing that's going to occur. That's the thing I wanted to talk about next. You have this period called the spring and autumn period that comes in. That's famous. It's well known. It kind of occurs between the 8th to the 5th century. So 770 to about 481 BC is when the spring and autumn period occurs. Like I was saying, that the Zhou kings, they lose power. They lose a lot of political and military power, and you get all these different states and factions that form throughout the country that's ruled by feudal overlords or lords. And you can see on the right, they start breaking up into different states, which at one point there were a lot of them. You can see, like, I forget, 10, 15 at least or more that formed throughout the country. And they call it the spring and autumn period because they think during that time there was a series of books that were called the Spring and Autumn Annals that were written about that period. Maybe they think compiled by Confucius. They're not sure that's true or not, but that's where the name basically came from. And so it's also the period where Confucius may have lived and where early philosophy starts kind of developing in China a long time ago. But what's eventually going to occur is that you'll get this period coming in called the period of the warring states, where you get all these different countries these states that kind of fight against each other and compete for power to control China. And eventually, by the 5th century BC, you get 5 main states that vie for power: Qin, Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhou, and Wei. Actually, it's really 7. They have that 5, but there's like 5 of them that are like the major ones that were big, that were part of it. With the Qin and Chu, being the ones that are probably really the major ones. Yeah, I think Qin, Chu, Wei, Zhao, Qi, and maybe the Yan also too as well. But Qin and Chu were the ones that were the largest ones of the states that kind of fought against each other. Chu was really the big competition more than anything. And over time, the Qin are going to conquer all the other ones. You'll get this unification where the kingdom of Qin or Qian is going to basically conquer all the other states by the 3rd century BC, and they'll form the Chinese Empire out of it. And that's why they call it China later. But we'll get more into that later next week when I talk about the rise of the Qin Dynasty and their empire under Qin Shi Huang that we were talking about in that short video. But yeah, that's kind of, you can see all the infighting between the different states. And I'll get to it later. That's also part of why the Great Wall starts to be kind of built early on, because they even start building fortifications to block each other. And later when the Mongols and the Huns and others kind of start invading, they'll also have to build a wall above China to block them as well. Now, I did want to talk about today as well. I want to get into and talk about philosophy also, because, Chinese philosophy started to really kind of develop in China back then. Of course, one big, Chinese philosophy that's the most famous overall is Confucianism, which you see in that image, right, which is, I guess, supposed to be a statue of Confucius. And Confucius was believed to be a Chinese philosopher. He was also a politician that lived, they think, somewhere between the 6th and the 5th centuries BC, maybe close to 500 BC, about when he lived. And Confucius didn't really like the way China was going under the Zhou, because the Zhou was declining. There was a lot of decline in moral ethics and things like that. The family was declining too. And so he kind of wanted to come up with his own type of social system to kind of change society in China. And so what is Confucianism? It's like a type of philosophical religious system. It's based on the teachings of Confucius. And part of what Confucius wanted to do was he wanted to create better, he wanted to do mostly things dealing with social matters, political matters, even moralistic, ethical matters that could better society, in the way of life, and also better government being run. Like the idea of having like civil service, testing for civil servants and things like that was something that Confucius came up with originally. And why is he called Confucius? His real name is Kung Fu Su, which supposedly means Master Kong, is what it really means. But apparently, Jesuit priests in the 1500s that came to China, I think Portuguese, maybe, or Spanish, called him Confucius, kind of slurring the name. And so that's how the name basically came about. And they do think they think that Confucianism and a bunch of other philosophies in China started in a period called it's called the 100 Schools of Thought, they called it, which kind of occurs between the spring and autumn period and the Warring States periods, like 6th century to about the 3rd century is when a lot of your Chinese philosophies get started in China. And these are examples of some things that Confucius wanted to do to improve Chinese society. One was the so-called 5 relationships of Confucianism, which are sometimes called the 5 bonds also as well. He thought that people ought to have proper conduct in society, act a certain way among people. A lot of it involves filial piety, which we'll talk about. And those are the 5 basic relationships in Confucianism with each duties in their code. Father and his son is like the first one, usually, where the son has respect to the father because he's older in general, elder brother, and the younger brother. So the younger brother has more respect for the elder because he's an older person. Husband and wife. Quite often, of course, in China, the wife is subservient to the husband. The husband's older too, as well. Friend and friend should act a certain way. Then ruler and subject. The ruler should treat the subject a certain way. Subjects should be more subservient to the ruler, follow laws, and things like that. Have proper conduct, of course, in society. Filial piety is also something else too that's a big part of Confucius. You see a lot in Buddhism and other kind of also similar types of philosophy as well. Confucius said there are 3 degrees of filial piety. The highest is being a credit to our parents. The second is not disgracing them. The lowest is being able to simply to support them. So it's kind of a quote from Confucius himself. And so obviously this has to do with, giving respect towards your elders, not disgracing your family name, things like that. And so filial piety is a big part of course, Confucianism also as well. You see it a lot in a lot of Eastern Asian cultures as well. It's a big part of different religions as well, Buddhism, Taoism, etc. Overall. They have also another thing which is kind of similar to it. I did want to mention about before I get to the golden rule too. Ancestor veneration, you'll see that too as well, where they honor the dead, respect the dead, and things like that is also another big part of also Confucianism as well. But you also see that too in other similar Eastern religions, Buddhism, Taoism, etc. So ancestor veneration is also big too. But the golden rule, that's probably considered to be one of his most famous teachings or sayings that's associated with Confucius and the system of Confucianism. And you can see right here, here's kind of an image of it right there. But usually treat others the way you want to be treated. If you want like the actual translation from Chinese, usually it's do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself. I think that's usually the proper translation of it. But basically, I guess in a nutshell, treat others the way you want to be treated. There's variations of it, of course. Yeah, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. I think it's another variation of it also as well. You'll see sometimes. Yeah, the golden rule shows up everywhere. In the Bible, you've got it like in the New Testament. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, example, etc. Or the Torah, thou shalt not avenge, not bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. It's kind of similar to that first one right there. The Quran, too. Quran has it, too, also. And I think it even shows up, I think, as well, as far back as the Hammurabi Code. There's some instances that are variation of the golden rule that show up as well. By the way, about Confucius, a lot of his writings are written down like in the they have the Analects. You may have heard of Analects of Confucius, which is very famous, which is like a book composed of sayings or ideas that were attributed to Confucius. And so, yeah, I think the golden rule kind of originated from that a long time ago. And they also have I think the five classics or something like. There's different names that they've got different books, of course, on Confucius that are out there that are famous. So he's highly influential in a lot of Chinese philosophy. Also, I guess, influenced a lot of Chinese like folk religions and things like that as well that are in China. Here's kind of like you can see a map here, but how it spread. So it kind of started in China, and then it spread to different parts of the world. So Korea, Japan, Vietnam, I think, is mostly influenced by Confucianism. But you see, it went down like Vietnam. They think it maybe even went westward and may have influenced like Buddhism, as an example. Taiwan also influenced. Of course, you see like Korean countries, I guess South Korea especially. I guess North Korea, sure, they try to crack down on different ideas, but you can see most of it's based in East Asia, where Confucianism is real popular. Yeah, here's kind of world religion. So, like your Chinese traditional religions are really fifth ranked overall with religions throughout the world. Christianity being the largest, followed by Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and your Chinese traditional religions, which might be like also folk religions and things like that. Up to 400 million maybe practice, or 5% in the world. Don't really count the secular atheists. I don't know if that's really a religion, that kind of thing. But you can see pretty much as a religion, and they believe in gods too, the Confucianists, some kind of supreme deity. But fifth largest pretty much overall in the world. Now, they do have also this other famous philosophy that was kind of a challenge to Confucianism, which is called Taoism or Taoism. They dubbed it, and it countered it. It actually was kind of against it, Confucianism at one point. And although I think they kind of influenced each other later over time. And Taoism was a type of Chinese philosophy that was invented by that man right there you see named Lao Tzu, who lived in China roughly about something like 2,500 to 2,600 years ago was when he lived. And his name, Lao Tzu, to spell different ways, supposedly means old master. And he had a major influence on not just Chinese philosophy, but folk religion and medicine, and even, we'll get to it later, martial arts, believe it or not. Kung Fu and other similar types of martial arts in China were kind of influenced by him. And what is Taoism or Taoism? It's a type of belief system that seeks harmony with nature and in inner feelings. Like I said, it opposed Confucianism, and Taoism was more based off of trying to find meaning in life, spiritual elements, and things like that, and living with nature and the universe. Compared, let's say, Confucianism was more about society and living a certain way that would better everybody. And so it's quite different compared to, Confucianism. In fact, Taoists tend to be traditionally nonviolent. They kind of denounce it, believe it or not. It's kind of funny that martial art is kind of, influenced by it. And of course, one of the big things they talk about is water. The "be like water" was the famous quote. Of course, they would say, "Where water goes with the flow, but is unstoppable," that kind of thing. And a lot of the teachings of Lao Tzu were based from a book he wrote called Tao Te Ching, which means in Chinese the book of the way or the book of the path. And so in Taoism or Taoism, the word translates as meaning the way or the path. And so they're talking about trying to follow the way or the path in the whole universe. They also thought government was unnatural. Those kind of things, trying to change too much in society usually makes things worse. I think Taoists want to live more in nature and things like that, etc. Now, I was talking martial arts. They say Bruce Lee, if you know about that famous, one of the most famous martial artists in history, famous for his movies later, Enter the Dragon or whatever, was famous for being influenced by Taoism. So he's famous for that quote right there: "Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water. You put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes a teapot. Water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend." Of course, his famous quote that Bruce Lee said. So obviously, yeah, Bruce Lee was heavily influenced by Taoism, and they think Taoism, like I said, influenced martial arts at one point. Also, I did want to talk about yin and yang. They think that was another form of um, Chinese philosophy that dealt a long time ago, the yin and yang school, which heavily influenced Taoism and later Confucianism as well. That's this idea that in the universe there's opposites, good and bad, and things like that, dark and bright or dark and light, that kind of thing. So yin on the side, yin side, you got female, dark, weak, passive, earth, confusion, turmoil, conservation, water. And yang, see on the right, male, bright, strong, active, heaven, peace, serenity, destruction, fire. So you got that symbol, the yin and yang symbol, that's white and black, which are opposite of each other, which is famous for it. So Tao means the path, guides us through the universe. The path, one must keep things in balance or they will not have harmony. So that's what they're talking about with, of course, the way, the Tao. Then, of course, I sometimes talk about the art of war. That's also another thing that's very famous. If you know about the Chinese, they start to develop different ideas on military tactics and warfare, which Sun Tzu, was very famous for in ancient China a long time ago. And Sun Tzu was actually a Taoist. He actually was a philosopher of Taoism, believe it or not. But he was also believed to be some kind of Chinese general that lived right before the Warring States period in China. It's kind of debate about when he lived. 6th century to 5th century is believed to be when Sun Tzu lived. And he's very famous for his book he wrote, at least they think he wrote it, which is called The Art of War. And The Art of War was considered to be one of the first major books that talked about military strategy and how to defeat an enemy on the battlefield. And they think it's credited by him, although it's kind of been debated about whether he wrote it or not. I think there's even a theory that one of his ancestors, I think his name was Sun Bin, may have actually written it instead. They're not sure. But it heavily influenced a lot of Chinese militaries and a lot of East Asian militaries like the Japanese and so on. And so The Art of War is a type of book that has influenced a lot of people militarily and even in the West as well. Now, some kind of quotes he would say: strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Or I think the one that's his most famous, you might have heard of: every battle is won before it is fought. So Sun Tzu, of course, heavily influential. They even think, of course, later, if you know, in modern times, a lot of people have taken Sun Tzu's writings, they've used it like in economics, like in the business world, and things like that. And so it's kind of influential, even I think in politics, they've kind of used it also as well. So that's kind of the beginnings of Chinese philosophy in ancient China at the time. I didn't get to legalism, which I'll probably talk about next week, because that's something that's developed later by the Qin dynasty, which comes in and creates the Chinese Empire under Qin Shi Huang. So we'll talk about him later, of course, next week. I'll also talk about, of course, the development of the Great Wall of China, which you see behind me, which eventually is really built to block barbarians that are trying to attack China back in ancient times. And I'll talk about the rise of all these other dynasties in ancient China. I'll especially get to the Han Chinese, Han Dynasty, and the Tang Dynasty. I think are the big ones. I'll kind of concentrate next week on and actually doing. So anyway, the Chinese Empire, it started about 2,200 something years ago. Would be the time period about when it began overall. So kind of put it roughly, I think about the 3rd century BC is when it actually begins in ancient China. I talked about this before, but it had to do with the Warring States period, which started back in the 5th century BC. It went on for like something like 2.5 centuries in China, where all these different states kind of fought it out because of the fact that the Zhou dynasty had declined. And of course, they had this kingdom called Qin. Sometimes they pronounce it also Qin as well. And it basically conquered all the other states and formed what became known as Imperial China, where China, of course, is ruled by, emperors afterwards. So yeah, they call it different names. You can see Qin is the common name, or Qin. I think I've mentioned this before, but Qin is kind of where you get the term China from. So it's kind of derived from this dynasty over time. It's a very short-lived dynasty. They're only around for a few years, or at least as emperors, they're only around for about 15 years. The dynasty itself goes back to about 246 BC, when it was originally a kingdom. But this ruler here, which we've talked about before, Qin Shi Huang, he was, of course, considered the one that really started the actual Chinese empire. He's the one that's the first emperor of China. In fact, it's usually kind of seen as, I guess, part of his name, Wang. Or also they spell it different ways. You'll see Chen Shi Wang or Wang Di. So it's spelled or said different ways, the way it's kind of written. But he's the ruler that actually unified the states together. They think he was some kind of Chinese general and king of the Qin state. And the Qin state would eventually end up defeating all the other states in that Warring States period. Because we had talked about how back in the spring and autumn period, you had this deal where the Zhou dynasty, its empire declined. It broke up into these multiple states during the spring and autumn period. And those are all the states that were part of it. I think at one point they had kind of a list of them right here. Those are the major states that were part of it, that were kind of involved in the Warring States. There were other ones too. But Qin, Qi, Chu, Yan, they had another one called Jin as well. And Jin broke up into 3 other states called Han, Zhou, and Wei. And so most of those, fought for control over China at one point. But you can see that one right there, which is Qin, just more to the far west. That's the one that would go on to conquer all the other states, of course, in these series of wars, so-called Qin Wars of Unification or Conquest, it's nicknamed, or the so-called period of Warring States, of course, for short. Here's another map right there. The Qin state, the kingdom, was based around the Wei River, which is kind of like a tributary of the Yellow River. They have a capital I'll get to later called Zian or Xianyang. It's dubbed. And that state will eventually defeat all the other ones. I want to say Chu, which is on the bottom. That one was probably the most powerful one and largest of the rival states. Qin would defeat that one and all the other ones and gobble up all the states into one unified empire afterwards. But here's a map showing you like at one point where the Qin state is. So you can see this particular state is mostly in the eastern part of China. And
I think at one point you can see it controlled part of Manchuria, where North Korea is, or close to. And you can see it went up to where the Great Wall is and came down to where the South China Sea is at one point. And then later China, like under the Han Dynasty, they'll push westward toward where the Gobi Desert is, where you see that western part of it at the top. And so China will start expanding westward, but that doesn't happen until the Han come in. Han Dynasty, of course, comes in a little later. Now, of course, one of the most famous things that I did want to talk about today that the Qin Dynasty is well known for. They're famous for, building the Great Wall of China. And that's one thing that Qin Shi Huang is very famous, where he's one, constructed the Great Wall of China starting sometime in the 3rd century BC. And part of why he did that, and he also built a network of road systems. That's another thing, I guess, that Qin Shi Huang did as emperor overall. And I guess in a sense that the Great Wall of China was too. It was actually a road system that ran east to west off their northern border as well. And as you saw in the video, that the actual early Great Wall of China was not built with like brick, which you'll see later in that documentary I'll share with you later in the week. The Ming Dynasty would later construct most of it using like brick, but early stone walls were constructed out of using like rammed earth, or I guess we call baked mud or sun-baked mud. And so the early walls were kind of primitive in construction. Of course, you can see images of the Great Wall, which are right here. There's reasons why I'll kind of get to the Great Wall of China, about why they constructed, but it's actually a linear fortress is what it basically is, because it stretches, across the northern border of China, between, I guess, China and Mongolia, toward the north. And it starts where the Yellow Sea in North Korea is, close to where the Yalu River is, in like close to North Korea. And it goes westward all the way in northern China into the Gobi Desert. And I've got like other images which are right here. So yeah, it's a military structure that they constructed to defend their northern border. I'll get to in a second, but part of why they built it was to defend the northern border from barbarians that were attacking into China from where Mongolia or the Mongolian steppe is. And it's a series of walls that were built over a long time. So this is built like from the time of like Qin's dynasty up to the Ming Dynasty, which is something like almost 2,000 years that they were constructing a lot of these fortifications. Some of the fortifications even went back to the time of like the Warring States period. The average length varies. I think the total length you see is over 6,000 kilometers, which that's about almost like 4,000 or 5,000 miles is about the range of it, of the Great Wall of China. Although they think all the walls, I think, are even longer than that. I think there's a story where, or at least they talk about it sometimes, that all the walls they built could stretch from the North Pole to the South Pole. All the construction that was done over like 2,000 years. It does have it has different names. The actual nickname of the wall that the Chinese sometimes called it is Wan Li Chang Qing, which was different translations of it. But sometimes it means 10,000 li long wall. In fact, quite often they will say it's the long wall was the nickname. And supposedly it means something like 5,000 kilometer long wall is the translation of it. But I think it's more or less that's how long it is from east to west across its northern border. But the Great Wall itself is it kind of snakes around like a dragon. It's not straight because of the mountains, the way they curve. But also they say that the Chinese didn't build the wall straight because they were superstitious about straight lines and all that. So that's kind of the name. They have other names. Of course, they sometimes call the wall later. Of course, besides Long Wall, they do call it sometimes later the Wall of Death because it was believed that thousands of workers were used to build the Great Wall. And when they died, they would bury them either in the wall or near the wall. So they sometimes call it that, or they joke that it's the longest cemetery on Earth. Although they've never really found actually bodies inside the wall. I think that's kind of a myth about that story. They also call it the wall of Genghis Khan because after the Mongols broke through the wall into China, the Ming constructed this new brick wall, fortification to keep out the Mongols. So they got that name. It was also called later as well. The Great Wall, I think, is more of a modern name. It's more what the Europeans, when they came to China, gave it, of course, later. Of course, it was built primarily because of these peoples called the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were these nomadic peoples of the Mongolian steppe that lived above China. And they were great horse archers using like composite bow and spear and I guess swords. And so they were a major threat to China at the time. And so they've been often compared to the Huns later. The Huns that attacked India, attacked Europe, maybe descendants of like Attila the Hun, you see later at the end of the Roman Empire. And they think they're ancestors of the Mongols as well, somehow related to them overall. And so that's part of why, the Chinese constructed the Great Wall of China in the end because of this threat from the north. So here's kind of a map of where the Xiongnu were, right above. That's a later map of the Han Empire, which would fight them later a lot. And so, yeah, they were considered a threat. And of course, over time, the Mongols will get more powerful, by the early 13th century, they'll attack China and break through the wall, and conquer China at one point. Here's another map of the Great Wall, which is right there. It's believed the Mongols broke through somewhere later above Beijing, where Beijing is, they broke through some of the walls right there, or some even probably went around the wall as well, because they're mobile forces on horseback. But the wall has only been breached twice, the 13th century by the Mongols, and then later by the Manchu in the 17th century. Which I think when they broke through the Manchu in the 17th century, they just let them in because there was some kind of civil war that was going on. Here I can see right there, so it goes like close to where the Yellow Sea and very, very, very close to the North Korean border. It's where it starts. Then you can see it snakes its way westward north of Beijing and then goes all the way westward towards where the Gobi Desert is. But I think across from like where Gobi Desert to the Yellow Sea, it's about 3,000 to 4,000 miles, like straight across. Here's another map, of course, showing you, of course, of the Great Wall of China. Here's other pictures of the Great Wall. The average height of the Great Wall, by the way, if you want statistics on it, it's about 25 feet wide. 25 feet high, which I guess if you want meters, 8 meters high, about how tall it is. And the average width is about maybe 15 feet. I think it varies. Some of the walls, 15, 20 feet at the most. So if you want meters, it's about 4 or 5 meters. And you see some images where they have like the watchtowers. They think along the Great Wall, there's about 25,000 watchtowers that were built along the wall to where they had housed troops to, I guess, watch over the wall in case they get attacked. And they even built beacon towers that stretch out like north of the actual wall to try and warn the wall if they're going to be attacked by Xiongnu or other forces that are a threat from the north. So yeah, there you can see how the wall kind of snakes its way, up and down the mountains. You can see how it's, like I said, the walls aren't straight or anything like that. Yeah, here's some other views, of course, of the watchtowers, which are right there. You can see. You'll notice, like sometimes on the walls, we have holes in the walls. Later, of course, the Chinese, if you know about this, were known for developing like bombs and grenades that would be used to throw bombs out at the enemy, like that are kind of below trying to attack the wall. They could blow them up. And they even had a deal where they would sometimes set bombs on the ground. Like had booby traps where forces came close to the wall, they could trigger them and blow them up and stuff like that. Of course, I did want to also talk about Xi'an. That, of course, was the capital of the uh, actual Qin or Qin state. That, of course, was founded in the 3rd century. It has different names. They call it Xi'an or Xi'an Yang as well. And then later, by the Tang Dynasty, it was called Chang'an, which I think is its traditional name that it's often nicknamed. And I think at first the city's kind of small, like under the Qin and under the Han Dynasty, maybe 300,000 lived there. But by the time you get to the Tang Dynasty, it becomes one of the first million-man cities built in the world. Like over something like 1 to 2 million people live there at one point. And it is very famous for his tomb that he constructed there, which is the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, where he was built this huge mausoleum to guard him in the afterlife. And they think it looked like if you look at that image there, it looked like a pyramid. I think the way it was kind of constructed at one point. And on the inside, it had some kind of model of the actual city of Xi'an at the time. Which had supposedly had some kind of lake of mercury that it was kind of built around, almost like booby trapped inside or something like that. And if you know about his tomb, he built this famous army inside of it that was called the Terracotta Army, which was they think something like 700,000 workers built this mausoleum that was used to kind of protect him in the afterlife. And the Terracotta Army was a collection of these sculptures of, like, I guess, his soldiers that were part of his armies at the time. And supposedly a lot of the actual soldiers you're looking at may have been actually real soldiers that posed for some of the statues that were part of it. And it had something like 8,000 soldier statues that were part of it, 130 chariots, and maybe over 500 horses that were included as statues. So he may have had something like 8 to 10,000 statues or more that were constructed as part of it. And the actual tomb wasn't found until like the 1970s. I think 1974, the tomb was actually found by some local farmers in China near Xi'an. And so that's kind of why they know about the Terracotta Army. But terracotta is like a type of clay that they would use to make pottery out of, statues and things like that. And they say like the statues, like some are like lifelike, the size of human beings. And you notice like the hands, how they're kind of open. I think when they found some of the soldiers, they still had weapons in them, like swords in their hands, believe it or not. And so they were actually armed with weapons, some of them, and things like that. It's a big tourist attraction thing today. People want to go see the Great Wall, but a lot of people want to go see, of course, the famous Terracotta Army, of course, that's buried there, of course, originally. So here's other images, of course, of the Terracotta Army that he, of course, supposedly there was a deal where he buried some of the workers in it with when they constructed it. He didn't want to know, I guess, where it was built or whatever. So he's kind of secretive about this tomb originally when he constructed it in the 3rd century BC. Oh, and by the way, he was a harsh ruler. That's something I did want to talk about Qin Shi. If you know much about him, he's not exactly a popular ruler in China today. In fact, he's very brutal. He had this type of government he developed called legalism, which was like a type of authoritarian type political philosophy where they wanted a centralized government with a powerful monarch, like an emperor. And one thing about the Qin, they stressed punishing people over, say, giving rewards, which I think Confucius was the opposite. Where under Confucianism, they would reward people rather than punish people. And so that's something that they were kind of famous for. And kind of further image right here, but they think that legalism was a type of political philosophy that developed in the 3rd century BC. And it was kind of this movement to destroy other philosophical movements like Confucianism. I think they tried to wipe out remember that 100 schools of thought we talked about? They were trying to destroy some of these other philosophies in the country. And one thing they did was they banned a lot of books that had to do with that or any kind of knowledge that was important. He banned books. He burned books. The only thing they kept supposedly was agriculture and medicine that you could study. You thought that was the only thing that was really important. And they even had a deal where they killed people that are Confucianists. I think it was a case where he may have taken some of them and buried them alive, and just horrible things like that he was known for. So he's kind of a brutal monarch. And of course, he forced everybody to build the Great Wall. Well, it may have been built from like slave labor and things like that. And so that's part of why the Qin got overthrown. They were just too oppressive. And so the Han Dynasty later comes in and basically overthrows them because of that issue. That's the next thing we want to talk about, of course, is the so-called Han Dynasty that enters in at that point. The Qin is overthrown by the Han sometime at the end of the 3rd century. They do have supposedly a deal where Qin Shi Huang had 2 sons that briefly reigned as emperors, not very long, but they were soon overthrown by the Han. And that man there, you see in that image, which I think he called Liu Bang or Liu Pang, he's often called. And he helped start what they call later the so-called Golden Age of China, which lasts 700-800 years in China, which is the peak, really, of Chinese culture between the Tang up to from maybe the Han to the Tang Dynasty is the time period usually of it. Peaks really around close to about the 9th, 10th century usually. One thing about the Han, it is the longest reigning dynasty in Chinese history, imperial one, ruled by emperors, which is close to about 400 years. The founder is a man named Liu Bang or Pang, as you pronounce either way. And he was some kind of Chinese commoner. He came from the lower classes, and he rose up through the Chinese armies as a general, and eventually seized power close to about 206 BC. And here's kind of an image of him right here. He has another name. They later call him Gao Su or Ko Su is what they called him, which Ko Su, I think, was a kind of a nickname that meant either high founder or exalted ruler. I think it was a title or nickname that they called him after he was that died. That's what the Chinese dub him later. And one thing about the Chinese at that point under the Han, they start bringing in Confucianism, which for a long time had been rejected by the Chinese. And so you get this idea of adopting state Confucianism into not just government, adopting say reforms in government, but also in society as well. And so they kind of rejected the whole brutal aspect of legalism. They kept the idea of a centralized government with an emperor, but the brutal aspect where they were punishing people, they kind of went away from that, and Confucianism kind of rewards people for doing good things rather than punishing you for doing bad things the most. You can see there too, besides being the longest imperial dynasty, also a lot of Chinese relate back to this dynasty. In fact, I'll talk about the Han Chinese, of course, and supposedly the name Han originated from the Han River, which is a river that's kind of in, I think, central China is about where it's located. You can also see in that slide, economic prosperity began. One thing about the Han, they're the ones that began to, build for, I guess, link up the Silk Road, that trade route on Asia that pushes westward towards like the Middle East and Europe. So the Silk Road is something that they began under their reign as emperors. They standardized a lot of the coinage throughout China as well. They'll later have paper money as well. And then also the Han are known for a lot of innovations, which I think the biggest thing they started doing is printing and making paper, like wood paper and things like that. Here's kind of a map showing you the Han Empire under the Chinese at the time. So you can see there that their population may have peaked at about 60 million people at one point. Yeah, it peaks 206 BC to about 220 CE is the time period of it. And you can see how China expands. It conquers more of the southern part of China in the eastern part. It actually takes over Korea at one point. And then you can see that one of the main things that happens, of course, is it pushes westward into central western China towards the west, where the part of why that area, the western part you see in, that's where the Silk Road will go. It runs, east to west across northern China. And so that's part of why they defend that area, even extending the actual, Great Wall to the west as well. They rule from Chang'an, although it's still called Xi'an at the time. I'll get to it later. But the Tang Dynasty is the one that starts calling it Chang'an, which is one of its traditional names. It's called today. But Xi'an today, of course, I think is a city, or that metropolitan area in China right there I think has about 12 million people that live there today. I'll get to it later, but Chang'an, I told you, in the future is going to become eventually one of the first million people, city that'll be kind of forming at that time. But you can see the actual capital of Chang'an was on, or Xi'an as they called it back then, was on the Wei River, is where it's located. They do have another capital I'll talk about later that's also called Luoyang. It's located on the Yellow River to the east of Chang'an. So there's kind of an image of what will be for Xi'an still, I guess the name they're using, but Chang'an's the traditional name they called it in the old days that you're looking at right there. But yeah, I'll kind of briefly talk about some of the other emperors that were kind of part of the Han. They had an emperor named Emperor Wu that reigned between the 2nd century and 1st century. Yeah, that should be 141 to 87 CE there, right there. Actually, it should be BC. It's a typo there. But he's the second longest reigning emperor in their history overall. Reigning between the second and 1st centuries BC, and I think his reign is something like we could do the math there. 54 years is how long he was in power, and he was known for his expansionism. Is one thing he's very famous for. He kind of was sometimes called the military or martial emperor because under his reign, China began to. If you go back to this map here, they began to expand into different parts of China. From that map there, it's hard to see, but they would push down into the northern part of Vietnam at one point. Of course, southern China they conquered as well. They also conquered part of Korea, where North Korea is today. And they did push westward. That's one thing, that probably the most famous thing the Han did. They pushed westward into the Gobi Desert in western China, where the Silk Road will be built. And they would, of course, extend the Great Wall further westward as they would do that. The one thing he is famous for, of course, this particular emperor, he is very famous for defeating the Xiongnu. So that's kind of his big thing, as in because the Han would kind of push them back, northward, back into the Mongolian steppe, and then from there they'll begin to extend the Great Wall further westward, like I was talking about at that point. And that, as you see there, of course, in that map there, they push them back. And so, yeah, the Xiongnu at one point were occupying that area we're discussing in that western part of the Han will take. And so, under his regime, they'll conquer that area, you see, and push the Xiongnu back into Mongolia. That would help facilitate, the Silk Road being built afterwards. Of course, Silk Road was a famous trade network that ran from China westward into, linking up with India. And then you can see it pushed all the way into Persia and Mesopotamia, reaching at one point all the way to Constantinople, which will, of course, later be part of the Roman Empire. So they think that the trade networks of the Silk Road, something like between 4,000 and 5,000 miles in length. They even have, caravan routes that run down into like the Arabian Peninsula, and then, of course, also into North Africa, where all these different trade goods from Asia could be peddled, westward, of course, along the way. If you know about the Silk Road helped facilitate trade between China and the Roman Empire at the time. So I think the Byzantine Empire, note later, will eventually have silk or figure out silk itself, how to actually make it, and all that. And these are the kind of things that they, were pretty much came down the Silk Road toward the west. Besides silk, where it gets its name, also called Silk Route. I'll use that term as well. Gunpowder, of course, very famously, of course, goes westward. Paper, crossbow, the compass, pearls, glass, jade, tea, of course, definitely spices, and also diseases. I did want to mention that as well. But yeah, the Silk Road did kind of, they think, bring diseases to the West, especially like bubonic plague. I think as the Mongols pushed westward too, when they conquered that area, that helped to spread bubonic plague, and it's part of why the Black Death is real bad in the 14th century in Europe. By the way, silk for a long time was kind of secretive in China. If any foreigner tried to find the secret to it, they could put you to death for it. But they think by the Byzantine Empire in the Middle Ages, they figured out the secret to making silk. It's a mystery for a long time to some people, of course, but made from the silk worm. Here's some other things, of course, right here. The Han Dynasty is known for a lot of things that they invented. Of course, paper as being one of the main things that they invented. That was probably the most famous thing at that time. It was made by grinding plant fibers in the paste, and the paste dried in the sheets, and then they could make books out of it, scrolls, basically. And they had different kinds of printing. I think if you study about the Han, they had some kind of printing called woodblock printing, it was called sometimes. So like early forms of printing where they would print things on paper, seals, stamps, things like that overall. So early printing, starting to kind of develop, but like the movable type printer, that'll be developed later in China, probably close to about maybe 1000 AD or whatever, a little later. Farming, iron plow, they think kind of came about that time. Wheelbarrow as well. So those are kind of things they invented for farming to make farming much easier, make it easier to till the land and things like that. Seismograph, they think may have been developed about that time. Acupuncture, which, something the Chinese are very famous for. The compass, they do think that around the Han, the so-called compass, magnetic compass, is invented in China, which that'll have a major impact on navigation, ship navigation, especially in the West. Sundial, water mill, ship's rudder, those are things that they think may have been invented about that time in Han China. Although some of these may have been already invented in the West or similar kind of inventions that were kind of out there overall. There was a period under the Han where there was a separation. They have this deal where a man named Wang Mang seized power. Emperor Wang Mang, you see on the right there. He was some kind of official that was under the Han Dynasty, and he overthrew the government and took power in 9 CE, 9 to 23 CE. And he ruled his own dynasty that was called the Zen Dynasty. It was nicknamed, but he only reigned for like 14, 15 years before they overthrew him. He was the only ruler of it. And then what happened was the Han came back in and they basically took power again. So the Han Dynasty is kind of divided into 2 periods. You got the so-called former Han or Western Han, you see there. And then you got the so-called later Han or Eastern Han. And the reason why they call it the Western and Eastern is that the Western Han, the capital was at Zion or Chang'an, as they traditionally call it later. And then they have another capital they have called Luoyang, I may have talked about before. And Luoyang was on the Yellow River east of Chang'an or Zion. And that's where they would rule from, the Han emperors from there, including this one here, Guangwu, who overthrew the Zen state that briefly took power. And the Han continued for another like 200 years after that. So that's the story kind of the Han, how they, developed as an actual dynasty. So that one is considered to be one of the most famous imperial dynasties, at least in ancient China, a long time ago. So here's kind of another image right here, kind of showing like the old Luoyang, which is right there. So China has had a lot of capitals. I think I want to say 5 capitals at one point that China has had here and there. I talked about some of them already, like Xi'an or Chang'an, Luoyang. Later, Peking or Beijing, of course, will be another capital. I think also Nanking, I think, was a capital as well at one point in more modern China, though. Here's kind of a map here because I'm going to get to next. So they have a dynasty called the Sui Dynasty that later reigned briefly, which I think the Sui will come in for a short time period and reign, just for like, I want to say, I think they're around for like 30, 40 years as an actual dynasty. And the Sui kind of reigned in that same area where the Han were. And they reigned between like the 6th and 7th centuries CE is when they were around. And anyway, right there. I did want to get to the main thing today, which is the Tang Dynasty. The Tang reigned from 618 to 907 CE. So we're getting more up into like the end of the so-called Golden Age of China. It's called that, by the way, Golden Age of China, because that was the kind of peak period of like Chinese culture, art, literature, poetry back then. And so it's like a high point in Chinese history at the time. And the Tang were kind of very known for a lot of its reforms, especially within its government. Confucianism pretty much had spread throughout the whole region of China. They perfected, you can see there, the imperial examination system to, basically select a lot of their actual bureaucrats. one thing about the Chinese that they're famous for, you may have heard about, a lot of their bureaucrats were often what they call eunuchs. You know what those were? Eunuchs. And eunuchs were like castrated males that they would have as officials. They would run like the court and the government. They're usually deemed real loyal. They're even used as spies sometimes as well, eunuchs. But you can see other things too there. They had a liberal attitude towards all religions in China. You can see by the time of the Tang Dynasty, Buddhism has spread throughout China. I think they seem to think that Buddhism may have started spreading in China going back to like the first, second centuries. And then over time, around the Tang, Buddhism even started spreading into nearby countries, into Japan, into Korea, Vietnam, and parts of Southeast Asia as well. So it's starting to kind of spread throughout the world. And you can see that the Tang were even kind of had some foreign relations with countries like Japan, Korea, of course, and then also Persia too, because they traded a lot with the West, like in Persia and India, etc. So the Tang was basically, kind of important at the time. Kind of get to a little bit about the Tang, who kind of founded that ruler right there. You see Emperor Gao Su. He was the actual ruler that founded the state. If you know much about this, he overthrew what they call the Su dynasty, which was only around for I want to say close to about 40 years. Only had two emperors at one point that reigned under the Su dynasty. And he founded it. His real name was Li Wan, the so-called Li family, I think they called it. And he was later called Emperor Gao Su. And he would reign from 618 to 626 BC. And so he's kind of considered the one that would start the actual state of the actual Tang itself. We just see kind of a map of the Tang Dynasty of kind of what it looked like. So most of Eastern China, they ruled, and then part of the Western part where the Silk Road ran westward. Of course, like I said, they ruled from Chang'an, which, by the way, the Tang were the ones that basically called it Chang'an, which in Chinese it meant City of Perpetual Peace, was the nickname. The old name was Xi'an, which is now they use it. They call it now Xi'an or Xi'an Yang today. And its population grew over time, like somewhere I think 1 to 2 million was the size of the city of Chang'an. So at one point, it was one of the largest cities in the world, first million-person city that they had. And supposedly it was a huge city. Like they say, the city that the Tang built was like 8 times larger than what it was under the Han Dynasty, going back several centuries. And it was something like 30 square miles in size. That's how large Chang'an was. And so that's where a lot of the emperors reigned from at one point throughout most of the reign. Although I think there was kind of, I'll get to later, a brief time where sometimes they reigned at Luoyang also as well. They had other rulers too. There was a ruler called Tai Song as well. He was considered to be like a co-founder of the Tang Dynasty that reigned also in the 7th century. I think a lot of their great emperors reigned between the 7th and 8th centuries. And they consider his reign to be kind of a golden age. In fact, Tai Song is considered to be one of the peak rulers of the whole Tang Dynasty at the time. And Tai Song was the son of the founder, basically. The founder I talked about before, Gao Su of Tang. And under his actual reign, they would continue their expansion. That's one thing about the Tang. The Tang keep expanding westward towards like where I guess where the Turks are, Turkestan and that area in western China. And you can see all the territorial areas that they control at one point under the Tang: Korea, Vietnam, part of Mongolia, part of Russia. At one point, they kind of controlled, a little bit of Central Asia as well. So Tang are kind of expanding westward and northward as part of their actual empire at the time. They also, one thing about the Tang that's very famous, they had one of the only female rulers that they had in Chinese history. Only female empress they had. Her name is Empress Wu. She goes by different names, Wu Zetian or Wu Zhao. They called her, and she was actually the ex mistress and consort of Emperor Taisong, like under him. And evidently, she was real powerful as a figure. And she seized power, and she actually did not reign from Chang'an. She reigned from Luoyang, which was to the east of Chang'an along the Yellow River. And at one point, she ruled for something like 30, 40 years over China. And they think it's under her reign that Buddhism starts to become popular throughout China. And she was also a major patronage, building like temples throughout China. And Confucianism pretty much already spread too throughout China and began to spread also outside of China as well. So yeah, we've got like a female ruler, and that's the only one they ever had, of course. But she's not considered actually Tang. But I think they call her. I think it's called the Zetian Dynasty or something like that. Is what's usually dubbed. So she was kind of considered like a de facto ruler of the Tang in mostly around the late 7th centuries when mostly she lived. They have one more later I'll kind of mention, Emperor Xuanzong. He's another ruler who reigned in the 8th century CE. And he was the longest reigning Tang emperor, reigning around close to almost 44 years as a ruler. You can see 712 to 756 CE. And he's famous for a lot of things. They think he's the one that really builds most of the capital of Chang'an that we know of later. In fact, supposedly, I believe he was the one that called it Perpetual Peace. Like the nickname, the City of Perpetual Peace, is kind of coined by him. And so by the time of his reign, pretty much Chang'an has become like a city that's somewhere between 1 and 2 million. It's kind of debatable how big it was. I think some of the Chinese claim it was like 1.8 or 1.9 million or something like that, which we're not sure if that's actually accurate or not. But they do think it is one of the first million populated city in the world at the time. And China's got a lot of people. I think the population was a little somewhere between 50, 60 million was how many people were in China at the time of the Tang. But the Tang would later decline. And China would actually break up for a while before it kind of reunifies again as an actual empire. So here's another image, of course, of Chang'an. We're talking about one of the main capitals at the time in Imperial China. Oh, another thing you see here that's real famous by the time of the Tang is the Grand Canal. They think that under the Sui and the Tang dynasties, the Grand Canal was starting to be constructed throughout China on its east coast, of course, which will connect basically the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. If you know about the Grand Canal, it's like a type of intercoastal canal system, kind of like we have in Louisiana, like along our southern coast on the Gulf of Mexico. They built something like that too, which was mostly done to connect the Yellow River, which you can see, to the Yangtze River. So both these rivers try to connect them. And then you can see it also went up to where Beijing is as well, later one of their capitals. So that connected that whole eastern part of China. So they were able to connect all their major cities, and that was very important to trade, not just in going back to ancient medieval China, but also in modern China today as well. And I think the total length of the canal, if you want to know, they think it's like now close to about 1,100 miles in length, or if you want the kilometers, about 1,800 kilometers from north to south, right there. So yeah, it is a big part of their economy today, still in China. You can see how it connects all the different cities. Beijing in the north, all the way down to close where Nanking is, Yangzhou, Shanghai, and Hangzhou, and other cities that are down there. And you can see it then, it connects also to the Yellow River where some of their major cities were, Dian or Chang'an, and then Luoyang also as well. Now, they do have later, I'll kind of get into it too. They have later dynasties that develop in China. I'll kind of briefly talk about, because kind of going into like medieval to modern China. But here's kind of a list of different dynasties they have in China, like in medieval modern China. You have the Song or Sung dynasty that comes in the 10th century. China actually broke up at one point into like the so-called 10 Kingdoms period. I think they nicknamed it. And the Song reigned between about 300 years or so, 960 to 1279. And that dynasty was famous for reuniting China into like a empire again under one main emperor. And you can see they were known for a lot of innovations. They think that gunpowder was invented about that time in China. Also, paper money. They started Chinese, I think, were one of the first to use paper money as well. And then also, they built the first Chinese Navy in China, which doesn't do well later against the British. You know about that when the British come into China, etc. But later, the Chinese do actually kind of explore. I know, like around the 15th century, this happens later under the Ming Dynasty, but they explored parts of like the Indian Ocean. You can see also the movable type printing press was believed to have been invented close to about maybe 1000 CE. And so that's going to be an important invention that's going to lead to like printing a lot, especially in the West, when Johann Gutenberg kind of gets a version of it and develops it in Germany. That's in the 15th century, but that's some of that kind of affects the West later. Then in the 13th century, you get the Yuan dynasty that takes over China. That was a Mongolian dynasty that reigned over China. This was caused by Genghis Khan. What happened was in the early 1200s, Genghis Khan and the Mongols attacked China from Mongolia and broke through the Great Wall and took over the whole all of China. I think half of China was wiped out. And of course, Genghis Khan went on to conquer most of Asia, if you know about that, and part of Europe. And so in the late 13th century, the Mongols formed their own dynasty over China called the Yuan dynasty. And the most famous emperor was Kublai Khan, who reigned kind of late 13th century. And so the Mongols reigned until 1368 before they were thrown out by the Ming, 1368. The Ming took over China. The Ming, of course, were known for throwing out the Mongols. And because of that, they were kind of concerned that the Mongols would try to invade again. And so they decided to build a better Great Wall. And so the Ming are the ones that built the main brick one that we see in a lot of images, the Great Wall of China today that are now around. It was mostly built around the 16th century when most was constructed. The Ming also moved its capital to Beijing, which Beijing is one of the main capitals of China throughout its modern times, maybe except for Nanking, might have been a capital at one point. But that's where they start building like the Forbidden Palace, where the emperors will kind of reign for something like almost 400 or 500 years. And then you have one more dynasty you have later, which is the Qing or Great Qing dynasty that took power in 1644. The Qing were actually Manchu, which were Manchurian peoples that were up in the northeastern part of China. They invaded China, got through the wall, of course, took it over, and they basically made the Great Wall obsolete after that. And they reigned till 1912 as emperors. But during that time, if you know about it, especially by the 19th century, China gets taken over by a lot of imperial powers like Britain, Japan, Germany, and other states, the French that come in, etc. And Britain has more control, I think, than anything, about that in China. And they even neutralized their military and start taking over ports like Hong Kong, etc. And so China declined as a power. The empire really wasn't that powerful. The last emperor abdicated in 1912. Then you have two republics later. You got the Republic of China, of course, 1912 to 1949. The Republic of China was founded by this man named Sun Yat-sen. You may have heard of him. There's a university named after him, too, in China, Sun Yat-sen University. Anyway, that particular republic will be around from 1912 up through like World War II, and then up to like the early part of the Cold War. Most famous ruler of it was Chiang Kai-shek, who was a Chinese politician and general. He reigned until 1949, until the communists took over the country in 1949. And then, of course, you have the last state they have now, which is the People's Republic of China, which is a socialist communist state founded by Mao Zedong. Of course, this is the current state that's in power, and mostly a communist type government, of course, is in power today. Although its economy is more capitalist, if you know about China. And so that's the legacy of, China's history, how it kind of, evolved over time from, empires and dynasties and things like that over 3,000 years. And of course, now it's a republic. But obviously, if you look at images right there, you see the Great Wall, that's something that's a big tourist attraction in China. They're trying to preserve it, about that with the Great Wall, because some parts of it are kind of falling apart, and they're trying to, make sure to preserve it and repair it and things like that.